A lumberjack finds 3 Zulu women lying naked in the snow pile until one arm rises. The storm had thinned by dawn, leaving the world muted under a pale sheet of snow. Thomas Haller pushed through the drifts with his axe over his shoulder, breath curling in tight white ropes before his face. He was scouting the slope for fallen timber, nothing more, when his boot struck something softer than ice. He stopped. A dark shape lay half buried in the snowbank, still as cut stone. Then another beside it. Then a third. Skin exposed to the cold, their bodies stiffened by frost, yet arranged as though they had simply collapsed mid-stride. Their presence here made no sense, no camp, no tracks, no broken brush to show how they'd reached this remote ridge. Thomas dropped to a knee, pulse hammering. The first woman's face was turned slightly toward him, lashes iced, lips parted as though caught in the echo of a breath she never finished. Her skin was cold beneath his glove, colder than the air itself. He swallowed hard. "God help you," he murmured, leaning closer. Then the snow shifted. A tremor passed beneath his hand, small, unsure, like a spark refusing to die. Her arm thin, rigid with frost, rose a fraction, fingers curling weakly toward her chest before falling again. Thomas jerked back, heart thundering. All 3 were still motionless, except the one whose arm had moved. She was alive. He cast a glance around the empty ridge, but the only sound was the wind dragging itself across the pines. No footprints. No sled. No clothing. No explanation. Just 3 women, strangers in a land that punished even its own. Thomas slid both arms beneath the half-frozen body and lifted her against his chest. She weighed almost nothing. Her breath brushed faintly against his collar, weak but real. When he rose, his boots sank deep into the drift, snow grasping at his shins. "We're getting you out of here," he said under his breath. Unsure if she could hear him, but as he turned toward the tree line, the woman's head tipped faintly against his shoulder. Her eyes remained closed, yet her lips trembled as though trying to shape a word he didn't know. A language carried far from warmth, far from home, into a land that swallowed the living without remorse. Thomas tightened his grip and started the long walk back through the silent forest, knowing the storm had delivered something to his doorstep, something fragile, urgent, and impossible to leave behind. Thomas moved fast despite the drifts, leaning his weight forward as though he could outrun the cold clinging to the woman in his arms. The trees closed around him, black trunks, windless and still, and the world felt narrowed to the sound of his own breath and the faint rasp of hers. Behind him, the ridge lay quiet. The other 2 women remained where he had found them, unmoving beneath their thin crust of snow. He forced himself not to look back. If he stopped, if he let hesitation slow him, this one would die before he ever reached the line shack. The forest floor dipped, his boots sliding on buried ice. He steadied himself, pulling her closer. Her skin was rigid where frost had taken hold, but somewhere beneath that cold, life still trembled. Snow cracked above. A branch, burdened by ice, snapped and fell through the quiet. Her eyelids flickered. Not fully, just a shiver of muscle, a faint narrowing, as if the sound had brushed the edge of her awareness. Thomas kept moving, breath harsh, steam rising off him in ragged bursts. "You hold on," he muttered. "You hear me? You stay with me." No answer. Only the creak of his leather coat and the sigh of the wind, slipping between the pines. He reached a hollow where the drifts were thinner and stopped long enough to adjust his grip. Her head lolled against his shoulder. Strands of her hair had frozen into delicate, brittle threads. He cupped the back of her skull through his glove, steadying it. A low groan rose from her chest. Thought it was small, half-breath, half-sound, but it struck him with the weight of a shout. She was fighting. Somewhere deep inside her, she was clawing against the cold. Thomas quickened his pace. Warmth showed ahead at last. The faint outline of the line shack, its roof hunched beneath snow. The chimney was dark. He hadn't tended it since the night before, but fire was what she needed. And fast. He kicked the door open with his heel. Inside, shadows clung to the walls. The air bit at his face, cold as outside. He laid her gently on the cot, the thin blanket stiff with old smoke, and went to work with a speed he'd never summoned before. Flint, kindling, dry shavings. The fire caught with a soft bloom of orange, painting her skin with the first hint of color she'd seen in hours. Thomas knelt beside her, brushing the snow from her arms, careful not to disturb the frostbitten patches. He wrapped her in the spare wool blanket and moved the cot nearer the fire, angling her toward its heat. Her lips parted again, trembling with some effort at speech. He leaned closer. A breath escaped her, raw, fragile, yet deliberate. He couldn't understand the word, if it was one. But the sound carried something more important than meaning. Will, she was still trying. He set another log on the fire, watching as flames brightened and shadows crawled up the walls. The light revealed the bruising on her shoulders, the raw edges of cold along her ribs. Whoever she was, whatever journey had brought her to that ridge, it had been long and cruel. Thomas sat beside the cot, elbows on his knees, breath slowing as the heat finally began to chase the ice from the room. "You're safe now," he said quietly. "I don't know what happened out there, but I'm not letting you go." Outside, the wind shifted, carrying a distant groan through the timber. A reminder. There were still 2 bodies on the ridge, and he didn't know yet whether they were dead or simply waiting for someone to lift them from the snow. He looked at the woman beside him. Her eyelids fluttered again, slow as drifting ash. "Rest," he murmured. But even as he said it, his gaze drifted to the door, to the forest beyond, to the weight of the decision settling on his shoulders like new snow. Those other women might still breathe, and the storm would take them before noon if he did nothing. He rose, breath tight, eyes lingering on the slow rise and fall of the chest beneath the blanket. "I'll come back," he whispered, unsure whether he was reassuring her or himself. The wind pushed against the door in answer. He pulled on his gloves, took one last look at the fragile warmth returning to her face, and stepped outside into the pale morning, snow whispering beneath his boots as he turned toward the ridge once more. The cold met him like a wall dot. It took his breath for a moment, numbing his teeth, and he had to clamp his jaw shut and force air slowly through his nose. The sky was a washed-out gray, flat and merciless. No sun, no warmth, just a dull light that made the world look carved from bone. Thomas pulled his coat tighter and started back toward the ridge. Each step carved a new track in the drift. The earlier prints were already softening, rounded by small gusts that curled loose snow into their edges. He followed them up the slope, boots crunching, legs burning as he climbed. Thoughts pressed in with the cold. He'd left 2 bodies behind. Maybe they were bodies. Maybe not. If they'd still have life, it would be fading fast. The human body didn't forgive this kind of exposure. He imagined his foreman's reaction. If he knew Thomas was risking frostbite, maybe worse for 3 unknown women who had no business being this far north, this deep in the timberlines. He imagined the men's questions, the suspicion. Folks out here didn't see strangers often, and these strangers were foreign in a way that would stir everything people didn't understand. Everything they were afraid to say aloud. Thomas climbed anyway. The ridge rose gradually, the trees thinning near the top. He saw the bank of snow before he reached it, that same unnatural hump where their shapes had been swallowed. He slowed. The wind was gentler here, moving in low, steady sighs. It had dusted a fresh, fine layer over everything. For a heartbeat, he thought the snowbank had smoothed entirely, erasing them. Then he saw an arm, motionless, dark against the white, fingers slightly bent. Snow clung to them in crusted beads. Thomas approached, heart beating hard enough to pulse in his ears. The first woman lay exactly as he had left her, except now more of her shoulder was exposed, the snow having settled lower along her side. Her skin was nearly as pale as the frost touching it. He dropped to one knee and leaned close, listening. Nothing. No breath. No hitch of chest. No faint sound trying to become a voice. He pressed 2 fingers gently against the side of her neck. Waiting longer than he needed to. Nothing. He pulled the snow away from her face with slow, careful motions, clearing the ice from her nostrils and lips as though that act, at least, could return some small dignity. Her features were still foreign and strong. Her hair matted with frost, eyes closed. Rest, he said quietly. The word felt small against the open sky. He turned to the third woman. She lay partly turned toward the first, as if they had tried at some desperate moment to draw closer and simply fallen before they could. Snow had gathered under the arch of her back. Her ribs were sharp lines beneath her skin. He leaned in, forcing his hands to stay steady. Her lips were parted, ice clinging at the corners. He brushed it away, then waited, listening for the faintest whisper of air. There, just barely, a thin, ragged breath that almost wasn't one at all. But it was there. He felt another at his fingertips, weaker this time. "All right," he whispered. "You're not done." "Not yet." He moved quickly, clearing snow from her arms, her chest, anything that restricted what little her lungs could manage. He shrugged off his outer coat long enough to wrap it around her torso, shielding what he could from the wind. The cold bit into his own shoulders immediately, teeth sinking deep into muscle. He ignored it. He had no sled, no spare rope, no easy way to haul her down the slope. He studied the ridge around him, gauging distance, his own strength. The fading day. It would be slow, hard, but not impossible. He slid his arms beneath her, feeling the stiffness in her limbs. Her head fell against his chest, hair stiff with frost. For a moment he felt the faintest flutter against his sternum, another breath. "Good," he muttered. "Keep doing that." When he stood, his balance wavered. She was light, but the snow was heavy, and his legs already burned from the earlier climb. He found his footing and began the descent, planting each step with deliberate care. The wind shifted, sliding along his bare shoulders under the thin shirt. Pain spread there, a deep ache that promised worse if he stayed unprotected. He hunched forward, trying to shield both her and himself, jaw tight against the cold. The forest swallowed them again, trees rising like dark ribs around a white lung. The air seemed thicker here, sound dulled. Only the crunch of his boots and the strained rasp of his breathing filled his ears. Time blurred with the steps. At one point, he thought he heard a voice, a low murmur near his ear, but when he listened closer, all he found was his own pulse. The woman in his arms shifted once, a small movement, then fell still again. His shirt clung to his back with a mix of sweat and cold. His exposed arms burned in waves, then began to numb, which was worse. The shack finally came into view like an answer. Smoke now wove from the chimney in a thin line. The fire he'd left was still doing its work. Relief hit him so hard, his knees almost went out from under him. He forced them steady and shouldered the door open with a grunt. Warmth washed over them. Thin but miraculous after the open air. Thomas carried her to the empty floor space by the fire, no second cot. Nothing ready, and lowered her onto the rough plank boards. He pulled his coat tighter around her and then, hands clumsy, grabbed another blanket from the foot of the cot. The first woman lay there still, wrapped tight, face turned slightly toward the flames. Her skin now had the faintest hint of color. Her eyes were shut, but not quite as deeply. There was a soft crease between her brows, as if some distant thought troubled her even in unconsciousness. Thomas covered the second woman gently, layering blanket over coat, over cold, stiffened skin. He knew enough not to warm her too fast. Frostbite punished haste. He ranged her closer to the fire, then sat back on his heels. Catching his breath, he realized only then that his own hands were shaking violently. He held them before the flames. Watching the skin redden, the pain return in sharp, biting pulses. "Damn," he hissed under his breath. He flexed his fingers slowly. Feeling crept back, cruel and necessary. For a while, the only sound in the shack was the crackle of the fire and the shallow breathing of the two women. Staggered and fragile, like the first drips of thaw from an icicle's tip, Thomas rose, grabbed his spare shirt from the peg and pulled it on, then shrugged into an old, patched coat that offered half the warmth of the first. It would have to do. He took a tin cup, filled it from a melted snow pot above the fire, and waited for it to warm slightly. Then he knelt beside the woman on the cot, the first he'd found. "Come on," he murmured. "Try." He lifted her head carefully and touched the rim of the cup to her lips. At first, the water simply gathered there, bead-like, indifferent. Then, slowly, her mouth twitched. She tried to swallow. Most of it spilled. A trickle ran down her chin. He caught it with his thumb. Her throat worked again, harder this time. She managed a small sip. Her eyes parted a sliver. Dark eyes, unfocused, rolled weakly toward the fire. She blinked, lashes crusted, and then her gaze shifted toward the blur of his shape. He held very still. "Easy," he said softly. "You're safe. You're inside. Warm as I can make it." She stared at him, her pupils adjusting, confusion dragging across her features. Her lips moved. The sound that came was hoarse, roughened by cold and thirst. The syllables were unfamiliar, rounded in ways his ear wasn't used to. But there was a rhythm to them, a cadence that suggested a language carried from far away. "I don't—" He stopped, shook his head. "I don't understand. But you're alive. That's what matters right now." Her gaze drifted, unfixed, sliding past him toward the other woman on the floor. Something in her expression tightened. He followed her eyes. The second woman's chest rose in shallow, strained motions. Her fingers twitched beneath the blanket, a small, restless movement. "They were with you," he said gently. "On the ridge. One didn't make it. The other—" He glanced at the near lifeless rise and fall. "We'll see." The woman on the cot tried to speak again. A single word this time, broken in the middle. She swallowed, throat working, and tried to push herself up, panicked strength briefly lighting her muscles. "Easy," he repeated, laying a steadying hand on her shoulder. "You're weak. You move too fast. You're going to fall right back into the dark." Her eyes locked onto his face. For a moment, he saw more than confusion there. He saw calculation, wariness, grief pushing against the cold's numbness. He raised both palms a little, showing he meant no harm. "I'm Thomas," he said slowly, pointing to his chest. "Thomas." He waited, then pointed gently toward her. "You?" She stared, breathing uneven, as if the act of staying awake was its own labor. Her lips parted once more. A sound came so quiet he almost missed it. "Namusa?" She rasped Dodd. The name slipped into the warm air like something fragile and precise, belonging to somewhere the snow had never touched. "Namusa," he repeated, careful with the shape of it. Her eyes closed briefly, as if the effort had cost her, then opened again. She seemed to accept his use of the name, however clumsy. He nodded toward the woman on the floor. "She?" he asked. Namusa's gaze traveled shakily to her companion. Her brow furrowed. She whispered again, the word catching, pain dragging through it. "Zandile," she managed. "Zan." He tried it again, better. "Zandile." Her head tilted a fraction. Agreement or exhaustion. Maybe both. He didn't ask about the third. "The one still on the ridge," wrapped in a final blanket of snow. He didn't need a name for death, not yet. Not while these two clung so precariously to life in front of his fire. Wind pressed against the shack's walls, making them creak. Outside, the forest shifted, snow falling in soft clumps from branches. Somewhere off in the distance, an axe rang once, then twice. One of the other men, already at work, unaware of what the storm had delivered to the line shack. He would have to tell them. Sooner or later, this couldn't stay hidden. But for the moment, this one room felt like a fragile world apart, 3 lives sharing its air, knit together not by choice, but by cold and chance. Thomas sat between the cot and the hearth, where he could watch both faces. Namusa's eyes drifted again, heavier now, lids sagging with exhaustion. He let them close. She needed sleep, warmth, time. Zandile's breath stayed fragile but present, each one a small rebellion against the night they'd survived. He listened to those breaths, counting them without meaning to. Each one felt like a question. How had they come here? Why had no one come searching? What distance did you have to travel? What loss did you have to endure before you ended up naked in the snowdrift on the side of a northern ridge? He had no answers, only the fire, the slow thaw, and the sense that whatever story they carried, it would not sit light on the shoulders of this camp. His gaze went to the door. The ridge still held one silent form. He'd covered her with snow before he left, more by instinct than ritual, giving her to the ground that had tried to claim them all. When the ground thawed, if it ever did right in this place, he'd see her buried proper. For now, he drew a long breath, the warmth of the shack filling his lungs, and let his shoulders finally sag. Namusa. Zandile, he murmured, tasting the names. He didn't know it yet, but his life, measured in winters and fallen timber, had just split clean down the middle. Before the ridge, after the ridge, and in the narrow, smoky light of that shack, 3 strangers lay together on the threshold of what came next. By midday, the light had shifted to a flatter, harsher gray. The fire had burned low twice, and Thomas had fed it each time, careful to keep the heat steady rather than fierce. The shack smelled of damp wool, wood smoke, and something else he couldn't quite place, a faint, unfamiliar scent clinging to their skin, like distant earth carried on their bodies. Namusa dozed in fits. Her eyelids fluttered often, edging open, then sinking shut again. When she surfaced, her eyes searched the room with an alert, wary sweep, as though expecting something to leap from the shadows. Each time, he let her see him first, sitting by the hearth, hands open. Nothing threatened. Once, she whispered something too soft to catch, her hand shifting beneath the blanket. Her fingers seemed to call for someone. Zandile's here, he said, nodding toward the floor. She's here, not gone. Namusa's gaze followed his nod, landing on the bundled shape close to the fire. Her face tightened, a flicker of grief and determination mingling there. She swallowed, jaw clenched, as if the simple sight of her companion gave her both pain and resolve. Zandile remained at the edge. Her breaths came thin and uneven, like threads someone kept tugging, trying to pull more life from a dwindling spool. Her skin stayed gray around the mouth and ears, but there was a faint warmth beginning at her chest, where the blankets and coat trapped the fire's heat. Thomas crouched beside her and lifted the corner of the blanket enough to check her fingers. They were stiff, nails pale, but not blackened. Maybe he'd been fast enough, he hoped. The shack door shuddered suddenly under a gust of wind. Snow hissed against the outer boards. It sounded like someone rubbing coarse cloth over the walls. Slow and steady. Thomas straightened, eyeing the latch. He thought of the men back at the main bunkhouse. Breakfast clatter, jokes thrown across the long table, their coffee poured too hot. They'd expect him later, out at his usual run. If he stayed gone all day, someone would notice. He didn't like the idea of leaving the shack. He looked back at Nam USA. Her eyes were open again, fixed on him. She was awake enough now to read his face, to see his hesitation. Her gaze hardened slightly, like she sensed he was about to move away. "I have to get more wood," he said, nodding toward the dwindling pile. "More food. I can't keep the fire strong with what's left." She didn't understand all the words. He knew that. But something in his tone, the way he gestured to the fire and then toward the door, seemed to reach her. Her brow furrowed. She pointed weakly at Zandile. It wasn't a question. It was a warning. "I'll come back," Thomas said. "I'm not leaving you. I just need supplies. That's all." Namusa watched him, jaw muscles working. Her fingers tightened around the edge of the blanket, knuckles pale. He could almost hear the thought behind her eyes. Men leave. Men don't come back. He laid a hand over his heart, then pointed to the door, then back to the room. "Thomas," he said slowly. "Go. Back." Thomas comes back. Her lips pressed together. She seemed to weigh it, as though she could measure the truth of his promise by the steadiness of his gaze. After a long moment, she gave the slightest nod. It wasn't trust. Not yet. But it wasn't refusal either. He pulled on his boots again, shrugged into the old coat, and checked both women once more before he left. Namusa's eyes stayed on him until the door shut, as if she were trying to hold him in place with her stare alone. The cold hit harder the second time. He moved quickly through it, his body already tired from the earlier trips, lungs protesting the sharp air. The main camp lay a quarter-mile downslope, huddled along the cut where the river ran black beneath ice. Smoke pillars rose from the bunkhouse and mess building, thin and unwavering. Voices reached him before the buildings did. Laughter. A shout. Someone cursing at a stubborn sled. He slowed, forcing his face into something neutral, steadying his breath. The last thing he needed was to stumble in looking rattled and draw more questions than the situation already demanded. Caleb spotted him first. Tall, broad-shouldered, with a beard that looked like it had been carved from oak bark. Caleb leaned against the woodpile near the bunkhouse, sharpening a broad axe. His eyes narrowed when he saw Thomas. "You're off your line this morning," he called, steel rasping softly against the blade. "Lose your bearings, or are you chasing ghosts up there?" Thomas gave something close to a shrug as he reached the main yard. "Storm knocked some trees in the north gully," he said. "Figured I'd check them before the snow crusted over. Needed to grab more wood for the line shack." Caleb grunted, unconvinced but not yet curious enough to pry deeper. "Foreman was asking for you," he added. "Said you weren't at breakfast." "I'll find him after I stock the shack," Thomas replied, stepping toward the woodpile. "That storm's not done with us. If I get stuck up there tonight, I want more than thin air between me and the cold." Caleb smirked. Always did like that shack more than the bunks. Less snoring. Fewer ugly faces. "Can't blame you." Thomas forced a faint smile. He loaded his arms with split logs, choosing the driest he could find, stacking them in a rope-handled crate. Then he added a sack of flour, a side of salted pork, and a small jar of coffee grounds from the storeroom, noting silently that he'd owe someone for those later. In the mess. He found Foreman Greeley sitting with a ledger, pencil scratching. The man's hair was thinning and gray at the temples, his nose red from drink and cold alike. He glanced up as Thomas entered. "You vanish early this morning?" Greeley asked. "Caleb said you were up the north line already." "Storm dropped a few trunks near the ridge," Thomas said evenly. "Didn't want them freezing into the bank. Checked them, then swung back to restock the line shack. Weather's turning quick." Greeley eyed him a beat longer than Thomas liked. "You staying up there tonight?" he asked. "You look like a man packing to disappear." "Just in case," Thomas replied. "If the sky closes in again, I'd rather be near a roof than halfway between here and nowhere. The foreman snorted. Fair enough. Long as you're on your run when the bell rings tomorrow. We're behind on the west stand. Thomas nodded. I'll be there. Greeley bent back over the ledger. Conversation dismissed. Thomas turned away, feeling the weight of his lies settle like fresh snow across his shoulders. They were small, practical lies. Necessary, he told himself. But they marked a line all the same. He was walking it now, one step at a time. On his way out, Caleb fell into pace beside him. You sure there's nothing else up there? Caleb asked quietly. You've got that look. What look? Thomas said. The one you had when the river took that greenhorn last winter. Caleb's voice was low, not accusing, just wary. Like you're standing on a story you haven't told yet. Thomas hesitated a fraction of a second. Caleb noticed even that. Storm made a mess, Thomas said. Ground's hiding things. Could use another pair of eyes tomorrow. Caleb studied him, then shrugged. You ask, I'll go, he said. Winter's long enough without a walk to break it. Thomas almost invited him then. Almost said, come today. See what I've found. Maybe share this burden before it grew heavier. But the image of Namusa's face rose in his mind, eyes burning with effort and suspicion both. He saw Zandal's fragile breaths, the thin thread that tied her to the world. Not yet. We'll see what tomorrow brings, Thomas answered instead. For now, I need to get this wood up there before dark. Caleb clapped him on the shoulder. Try not to fall in love with that shack, he said. Men talk when another man chooses solitude too often. Thomas offered a thin smile. Let them talk, he murmured. He left the camp with the crate balanced on a small sled, rope looped over his shoulder. The weight dragged in the snow, but it was easier than carrying it all by hand. As the camp sounds faded behind him, replaced by the hush of the trees, he felt the tension in his chest ease a little. By the time he reached the line shack again, his thighs burned and sweat chilled between his shoulder blades. The door stood where he'd left it, latched down, smoke curling steadily from the chimney. He held his breath a moment before opening it. Inside, the fire still glowed strong, casting a warm wash across the cramped space. Namusa's head turned sharply at the sound of the door, eyes alert now, body half tensed beneath the blanket. When she recognized him, some of that tightness left her shoulders. Not much, but some. I told you I'd be back, he said softly, closing the door quickly to trap the heat. He dragged the sled inside, just far enough to unload the wood by the hearth, then tucked the food near the corner. Namusa watched every motion, gaze sharp despite her weakness. Zandile still lay where he'd left her, but her breathing sounded slightly fuller. Each inhale a shade deeper. Thomas knelt beside her again. Her eyelids twitched as he brushed a knuckle along her temple. After a moment, her eyes slitted open, unfocused, irises gleaming darkly in the firelight. She tried to sit up at once. Her limbs failed her, trembling hard. But there was a wildness in her effort, a sudden, fierce panic. Her gaze darted around, landing on Namusa, then on him. Fear flared there, bright and unfiltered. It's all right, Thomas said quickly, palms up, voice calm. You're safe. Cold's behind you now. Easy. She didn't understand the words, but the tone cut through. Her breathing came too fast, chest hitching, but some of the fight turned to confusion. She looked to Namusa again, as if seeking anchor. Namusa was already watching her. Their eyes met across the small space. Something passed between them quick as a spark: recognition, relief, pain. Namusa whispered her name, voice still rough. Zandile. Zandile's gaze softened instantly. Tears gathered at the edges of her eyes, thawing faster than the rest of her. Namusa reached a hand out from the cot, fingers trembling. Zandile tried to lift her own and couldn't quite manage it. Thomas helped without thinking, guiding Zandile's hand up until their fingers brushed. They clung to each other like that, palms shaking, their breaths mixing in the smoky air. Thomas looked away for a moment, giving them what privacy the small room allowed. He focused on banking the fire, adding a new log, poking at embers until they flared bright orange. Behind him, he could hear their voices, soft, broken phrases exchanged in a language he didn't know. It sounded like something carved from river stones and sun, pressed awkwardly now into this narrow, frozen room. There was comfort in it, and grief, and the raw edges of survival. He stirred a pot of melted snow, added a pinch of salt, then cut small pieces of pork to simmer. The scent of it filled the shack, riding over the sharper tang of thawing wool. His own stomach growled, but he kept the portion small when he ladled some into a cup. He carried it first to Namusa. Slow, he instructed, demonstrating by lifting an imaginary spoon to his lips, then lowering it again. Small. She understood his meaning, if not his words. She took the cup, hands unsteady, and sipped twice, swallowing carefully. He saw the way her throat worked, the way her shoulders eased under the warmth. He gave Zandale the same. Supporting her head while she drank, her eyes darted between his face and Namusa's. Fear lingered there, but something else hovered around the edges now. 2. Curiosity, calculation, wondering. What kind of man found strangers in the snow and brought them into his fire without demanding anything in return? He wondered. Himself. He'd spent years on this frontier. Muscle and will worn into the timber. He knew the weight of his axe, the sound a tree made when it finally tipped, the dull thump it gave when it struck the earth. He knew what hunger did to a man, what long nights did. He knew how far a person could be pushed by cold and work. This, whatever this was, didn't fit any of those familiar shapes. When both women had taken what they could, he set the cups aside and settled on the floor between them again, back to the wall, stretching his legs toward the fire. Musa watched him over the rim of her blanket, eyes sharpening further with each passing minute. Her strength wasn't back, not by half, but her mind was returning faster than her body. She pointed at him again, slightly surer now. Thomas, she said, the name thick on her tongue. He nodded. Thomas, he confirmed. She considered him, then touched her chest lightly. Namusa, she repeated, as if reclaiming herself in this strange place. He inclined his head. Then she gestured slowly, first to herself and Zandale, then out toward the door. Beyond the shack, beyond the trees. Her hand moved in a line, then dropped suddenly, fingers splaying. It was a broken path she traced in the air. A fall. A lost. Her eyes met his, searching. He hesitated, understanding only fragments. Ship? He tried, drawing a rough shape in the air. Boat? Her gaze flickered, then steadied. She nodded once, sharply. He understood enough then to feel a cold that had nothing to do with winter seep into his bones. A ship, somewhere, somehow. A journey they hadn't chosen, or hadn't fully understood. Men with plans. Men with maps. And something had gone wrong, badly enough that 3 women ended up half-naked on a snow ridge in a land that didn't know their names. He exhaled slowly, firelight reflecting in his eyes. All right, he said, mostly to himself. We'll piece it together, one word at a time. Namusa and Zandale lay there near his fire, foreign as distant coastlines, yet as human as any man in the bunkhouse. Outside, axes rose and fell, trees died on schedule, and the river kept its slow black current under ice. Inside this single wooden room. The world had tilted. Thomas stared into the flames and knew, with a deep and steady certainty, that keeping them alive was only the first thing he'd done for them. The harder parts would come when the rest of the camp learned they were here. If you enjoyed, please subscribe and comment what country you're watching from. See you in the next one.